de este año académico. Y tenemos el gran gusto de contar hoy con Peter Andreas. Yo creo que es una presentación de lujo para abrir este calendario del seminario. Y nos va a presentar el día de hoy la introducción a la tercera edición de su libro Border Games, Policing the US-Mexico Divide. Y bueno, Lucía nos va a dar sus impresiones sobre el capítulo y después abriré a la audiencia para sus preguntas y comentarios. Como saben, son 30 minutos de presentación y 10 minutos más o menos de comentarios y después abrimos a preguntas de la audiencia. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Bienvenidos al seminario. Bienvenido, Peter. Muchísimas gracias por aceptar la invitación. And now I will switch to English because the presentation and comments will be given in English. So welcome, Peter. The floor is yours.
Gracias. Thank you for the invite, Maria. Nice to see you again. Never actually been to CIDE, but virtually counts, I suppose. So it's certainly easier to deal with Mexico City traffic virtually than in person, I should say. It's also really well timed because I just finished the manuscript on the third edition of my book Border Games, which I actually sent off to the publisher a week ago, but we're at the very start of the process, so I can obviously make changes and revisions and so on at this early stage, depending on your feedback. So as soon as we're done, I will write the editor telling them all the things I need to change based on your comments. And in fact, the book is not out until sometime next summer, probably sometime next August. So I do welcome your feedback. I do want to maximize discussion. And actually, I even have, if we have time, I even have questions for you all. I mean, you're all the Mexico audience and Mexico experts. So I would appreciate I have a captive audience. So I will ask you, if you don't mind, a few questions that have puzzled me and I've never really been able to fully understand. Anyway, I began my academic career actually studying the U.S.-Mexico border. My first solo authored book was Border Games. It's right here. Some of you have ever seen it. And it was my dissertation. It's actually been all downhill since then. It's definitely my most successful book, I should say. So, in fact, I did a second edition in 2009, pretty much prompted by September 11th, and then this new edition is prompted by Donald Trump, to be honest. Which will be out next year. I've moved on to many other projects since my initial interest in borders and the U.S.-Mexico border, but now I feel like I've at least recently come back full circle to where I began. So let me just tell you, the initial puzzle that motivated my interest was the simultaneous creation of what we could call a borderless economy and a barricaded border. It's the borderless economy was through NAFTA, and a barricaded border through intensified drug and immigration control. Actually, I'm just looking at the imagery. There seems to be a delay in my. Are you getting a fine contact and everything? Okay. Yes or no? Okay, it's okay. Good. So it's just on my end, which is fine. Anyway, so this paradoxical development in the 90s of simultaneously a rush to open the border, but also to harden it. And this was, a striking illustration of this global phenomenon, actually, but it was particularly striking along the US-Mexico border because here was arguably the busiest land border in the world, had also become, in a relatively short amount of time, one of the most heavily policed. Right, and so this was a relatively short period of time, border policing had gone from a pretty marginalized, low maintenance, low visibility, low politicized activity away from the center of national politics to a high visibility, high intensity campaign generating enormous political, media, and public attention. And this is all in the 90s, and so that's what my focus was on. So the research question then, and still is, well, what are the drivers of this sharp escalation of border policing? The indicators, the independent variables, so to speak, are sort of just the U.S. Border Patrol more than doubling in the 90s, and then actually doubling again since then. Staff and budgets going up, new technologies, new equipment. Also just the rhetoric about the border and the politicization of the border and the attention it received, and all indicators across the board would just suggest escalation. And I put it in the two main domains are drug enforcement and immigration law enforcement. And my argument then, and actually I'm sticking with it now, is escalation is ultimately less about deterrence than about recrafting the image of the border and symbolically reaffirming state authority. And so, I argued that it was politically and bureaucratically rewarding for key state actors, even if not necessarily particularly effective, right? And in fact, often with unintended and perverse consequences that fueled calls for more escalation. In fact, I think I dubbed it at the end of the book, this was a politically successful policy failure. I mean, Bill Clinton even won Orange County in Southern California against Bob Dole in the 90s because Clinton had become the sort of biggest promoter of more border security at the time. The larger argument that I was sort of my foil, who I was arguing against, was the sort of dominant discourse at the time and to the present that the escalation is simply a response to an increasingly out of control border. That there's this sort of loss of control narrative, and that what this is all about is regaining control. And so what I did also was try to historicize this, problematize that statement by saying, look, we never actually had control over the border. So you can't regain control over something that was never under control in the first place. And in fact, arguably the founding of U.S. economic relationship was smuggling. The first unauthorized migrants, which contributed to the Mexican-American War, mid-19th century, was unauthorized Americans moving to Mexican territory in the 1830s against Mexican law, and they created huge tensions. They also wanted to bring slaves, and Mexico was against introducing slavery. And that was a big contributor to the outbreak of that war, and all the way through to well into the 20th century, various smuggling practices well beyond drugs and migration as sort of pillars of U.S.-Mexico economic relationship. They're not celebrated, right? High tariffs between the two countries actually made the smuggling of legal goods extraordinarily important. The smuggling of firearms south during the Mexican Revolution, hugely important, often forgotten today when we talk about firearms smuggling into Mexico. So part of what I did in the book was also historicize the arguments that something fundamentally new and different was happening to provoke escalation. And I argued that to the extent that there was a growing threat, it was often a feedback effect of previous policy. So, for example, in the case of drug enforcement, the U.S., as many of you know, did a pretty impressive job at building up an interdiction campaign in South Florida in the 1980s to interdict Colombian cocaine that was coming in through Florida across the ocean. But the effect was to actually reroute the Colombian cocaine trade through Mexico, which was a gift for Mexican traffickers. I mean, the Mexican drug trade obviously goes back a century, but suddenly the most lucrative piece of the drug business, Mexico becomes an intermediary and charges a significant fee for moving the product into the US. And suddenly Mexican traffickers are far wealthier and more powerful than ever before, precisely as an unintended perverse feedback effect of the success of South Florida drug interdiction. So that's in the case of drugs. I want to now, brief, since don't have a lot of time, and I want to leave time for discussion. Then we get into the 90s, which was edition number 2 of Border Games, with a color cover instead of the black and white of the old. So they upgraded the amount they're willing to spend on the cover. And so, September 11th happens, and at first glance, it's sort of, well, what does this have to do with Mexico and the border and all that? Even these events in Washington and New York City, thousands of miles from the border, had these devastating ripple effects in terms of shutting down the border and securitizing the border and the discourse over border security, immigration reform, which was very much on the agenda. Right before 9/11, Vicente Fox thought we had a new relationship with George W. over migration reform. There's a lot of optimism at the time that forged a new relationship. That was all put on the back burner by 9/11, and the border became even more hardened and more securitized than ever before. But as I argue in the new edition, it really was not. The cliche is everything changed on 9/11. From the perspective of the border enforcement, I argued and continue to argue that it really just ratcheted up a previous dynamic of escalation. In fact, it allowed people to promote strategies, tools, approaches, and so on that predated 9/11, but then really were able to put it through the political process in a faster, more intensive way. So, the Secure Fence Act, continued, but in a much more aggressive way, the sort of fence building frenzy of the 1990s. But suddenly you have, the Secure Fence Act, that was a bipartisan science, it was George W. Bush, but mainstream Democrats all signed on pretty much. Hundreds of miles of new fencing in the 2000, after 2006. And in fact, the day-to-day activity of the Border Patrol was still very much focused on drugs and migrants, even though they said, in terms of framing what their job is, it was counterterrorism as priority number 1. But in practice, they got all these new tools, new funds, new fencing, and so on from counterterrorism, but it was all basically used for the same old border missions as before. We have a new discourse, Homeland Security, a term that people never used before 9/11. Suddenly, it's a reorganization of our vocabulary, but also bureaucratic reorganization. All these different agencies put together, the biggest reorganization of the federal government in the U.S. since World War II, actually. So Homeland Security becomes part of our sort of daily language to describe what's going on in all things related to borders. And Homeland Security, by definition, that term means the borders become more securitized than it had ever done before. And the key thing I want to emphasize here is just how bipartisan that effort was. There was, to the extent that it wasn't bipartisan, there was a scramble between Democrats and Republicans to outdo each other in proposing, to showing their commitment to border security. But basically, they were on the same page. They were basically promoting the same kind of strategies and so on. A lot of consensus across the aisle, which then brings us to the Trump era. If September 11th hyper securitized the border, well, Trump hyper politicized the border like never before, which of course then prompts, the new edition of the book, which is, this fat manuscript here. Though it is actually a fairly thin book. The difference, though, is that, you know, when I published that first edition, it was not a particularly crowded world of books on border enforcement, border policing, the politics of border control, and so on. Certainly in political science, which is my main field, I was a bit of an orphan. I mean, it was a strange, weird topic for me to be. And it's not as if it's gone super mainstream even today, but it, you know, just across disciplines, history, sociology, anthropology, public policy, criminology, you name it, it's just a surge of interest since 9/11, but also especially since in more recent years, and all things border related and border. So, you know, so building on that extraordinary rich literature that's emerged since my first book version came out, I want to really sort of dissect what has happened in the Trump era. And, you know, what I found most fascinating is, you know, it started even before Trump took power, because, you know, remarkable to me that his main campaign slogan was "Build that wall." I mean, this was the centerpiece of, you know, there were a number of pieces to it, of course, but the most popular campaign slogan at his rallies was "Build that wall." And it was extraordinarily effective. I mean, it was the biggest applause line at his rallies. It was a simple idea. It was very visible, very concrete. It could be used to symbolize all sorts of things: nationalism, white supremacy. It was anti-immigrant without saying you're anti-immigrant. I mean, it was easy for Trump to remember. I mean, basically, there's you know, we now have documentation that essentially they came up with the idea to just keep him on topic. He didn't understand immigration. It was a complicated issue. Couldn't talk about it very well. A wall he could talk about. He was a real estate developer who liked to build stuff and boast about building stuff, and this would be his biggest construction project. So it was really, I mean, brilliant in a sense, and it worked. I mean, you know, it's not entirely clear how much it mattered in electing him, but it's interesting. It's clear that he thought it's what he was elected on. And so he immediately, upon taking office, you know, there was this imperative to follow through for his base on Build that wall. Ann Coulter, you know, a prominent, you know, policy talking head who Trump was listening to everything she was saying. You know, she had a manifesto for him, you know, in his first day in office. And she says, item number 1, build the wall. Item number 2, build the wall. Item number 3, build the wall. Item number 4, build the wall. She went on to, I think, 100. This was like the priority. And so even if he wanted to, which is not clear he wanted to, he could not backtrack on that campaign promise. And so he basically went to Matt. And what's fascinating politically is that, you know, the distinction between a wall and a fence is kind of just language. And, you know, there'd been a fence building frenzy for many years, but Trump was the first one willing to actually call it a wall. There was kind of a wall, it was a taboo word before Trump. In the 90s, it was too close to the Berlin Wall. Walls were bad. We were in a celebratory, you know, tearing walls down mood. But by the time Trump was running for office, times had changed, and calling a wall worked, even though it was offensive in Mexico and it was offensive in Democratic circles. And frankly, even his Republican opponents in the primaries, you know, weren't willing to go there. But he was willing to do that, and it worked for him. But then, even though escalation continues under Trump, precisely because he politicized the wall so much, it was impossible to rebuild the bipartisan consensus that had built up the border for so many years. It was a political hot potato. No, there's no way that people like Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or anybody could sign on to a border wall. They were perfectly happy signing on to more border security. Billions of dollars for more border security, all sorts of initiatives, more fences, more technology, more agents, and so on. But they simply would not sign on to a border wall because he had basically made it his wall. And so to be pro-wall would be pro-Trump. And so that was just a political non-starter. So he shut down the government to get his wall. And when that didn't work, he then actually used money from the Pentagon to continue to build his wall, and didn't quite finish it. He built several hundreds of miles, but the real political trick was that he somehow convinced his base that when he took office, the border was wide open. But the fact is, there was this border buildup since the 1990s, as I wrote a whole book about, the first edition of sort of the dramatic escalation of border enforcement in the 90s, and then in the first decade of the 21st century. But he pretended as if none of that existed. Yet his construction project would essentially build on, rather than tear down, the old infrastructure that was already there. He only half succeeded in his construction project. I just have a few minutes left. As you notice, I haven't talked much about what's going on the Mexican side of the border, but I hope we can talk about that in the discussion, and also get your obviously knowledge on that. But just sticking to sort of U.S. politics around this, what's fascinating is although Trump prompted me to do an updating, Trumpism has basically, we still have the echoes of it. It's left a lasting legacy that has very much shaped the Biden administration's approach to the border. And what's interesting, comparing today to previous politics of the border, what I call the border game, the politics of the border game, have really fundamentally changed, because what used to be easy money politically from Democrats, promoting more border security through the 90s, through the first decade of the 21st century, now it's much more of a political minefield. I mean, you basically, if you're seen as too tough, people, your progressive wing of your party accuses you of being like Trump, right? And if you're too soft, the Republican opposition slanders you with the term "open borders Democrats," which is a ridiculous statement, since Democrats were as enthusiastic border builders, for decades as the Republicans. But anyway, the label "open borders Democrats" is something no Democrat wants to be labeled with, and so they're caught in this conundrum that there is no bipartisan consensus anymore. It's hard to rebuild it. Biden comes into office immediately saying he's stopping construction on the border wall. So he does that. The bulldozers stop, right? They just but he's not tearing it down. He's not tearing down the wall. And he's not actually rolling back certain key Trump initiatives, including Title 42 deportations under as a public health emergency because of COVID. Like, that's very much continuing right to today, despite a lot of pressures from various sources to do so. The politics in terms of getting Mexico and Central American countries to do more to stop migrants from even reaching the border has very much continued to today. Mexico essentially serving as Trump's wall to stop Central Americans from reaching the US very much continues, right? The militarization of drug enforcement, which has been moving for years, if not decades, has very much continued. So in many respects, the language is toned down, and so on. Some of the most draconian initiatives, family separation and so on, were ended. But Biden has arguably done a combination of Obama, Trump border policies, and unlike the past, it's not at all clear that this is something that the Democrats can gain a lot of political mileage from. I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris, she's immediately appointed as the person who's working on migration, and so she goes to Central America. But because she didn't stop at the border first, she's chastised by Republicans for ignoring the border crisis. And her handlers try to tell them, no, she's not the border czar. She's not the border, the border isn't what she's interested in. But the media forced her to then go to the border. I mean, she then went to the border a few weeks later, right before Trump, even after his presidency, then went and toured the border with Texas Governor Abbott, who's promising to keep building the wall even in the absence of Trump. So Trump border politics continue even into the Biden era, and people like Harris, who've now been dubbed by Republicans as the border czar and therefore failing at her job. She's simultaneously attacked from the left for telling Central Americans don't come, but attacked for the right for not paying enough attention to the border. So, I conclude the book with a revised conclusion, sort of projecting into the future, suggesting it's going to continue to be a source of policy frustration, where sort of promoters of finish the wall are going to be frustrated, but promoters of open borders are also going to be deeply frustrated. And I don't make any predictions, except that I can assure you that some Republican in the not too distant future is going to campaign on finish the wall. So that I'll just end my comments there, since I'm exactly, I think, at the half-hour mark. And obviously we can discuss. We have a lot of time for discussion, and I think we have some commentary right afterwards. But I do want to make sure we also get to my questions about Mexico itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Congratulations on such a successful book. I didn't say anything about it, but yeah, having the third edition of your dissertation, I think it's a dream that none of us will be able to reach. So congratulations on that. We will figure out a way to bring you in person to see them at some point. But for now, we will move now to Lucia's comments. Welcome, Lucia, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria, for the invitation to read the text and to offer some thoughts on the introduction to the third edition of Border Games, and to Peter for the opportunity to engage in this conversation about sort of the themes in the book that are so central and important to contemporary security issues that affect not only the relationship between Mexico and the US, but undoubtedly have lessons beyond. As I was listening to you talk just now, I was thinking, well, really Border Games seems like a sort of like a pioneering book in political science, for sure, within, this thing that is now super popular, the politics of policing more generally, images of security as punishment, really, and as in a sort of othering. I kept thinking, like, I was recently reading Vesla Weaver's Arrested Citizenship, and I think a lot of the themes that you touch on are part of the book as well. Janila Gonzalez's book about authoritarian policing in Latin America. I think that there's a broader, overarching theme where perhaps border policing is kind of like a part of this broader, discussion about security. So I figured I would offer some thoughts and pose a few questions that maybe we can use as take a starting point or not for the discussion later. I don't pretend to do justice to the very many provocative points that you raised in the introduction in the book more generally, but I picked some aspects that I thought perhaps were relevant to me or are interesting to discuss. So the book challenges us to sort of rethink many of perhaps commonly held assumptions or beliefs about policing borders by centering attention on the policing of maybe these two types of illicit cross-border flows, those of undocumented migrants and of drugs. And I think the invitation in the book is to think of border policing practices as the result of interactions, and you say it explicitly, interactions between politicians, bureaucrats, and ordinary people. And in doing this exercise, it becomes evident that border policing is a lot more than a technical issue where we decide which agents with which technology at what times of the day are doing the policing. And rather border policing and the decisions about whom or what we police and how becomes sort of the political issue, and notably a performative one, as you suggest in the introduction. So I think there are 4 themes that I would like to mention. Sort of the construction of notions of illegality and security, I think, is one of them. The state is an enabler of this illegality. The individuals that do the crossing and those who do the policing. And so the first theme, or one of the themes in the introduction, pertains to this construction of the notion of the illegal, right? And illegal crossings as part of the definition of what a border is in itself. Clandestine flows as crime are used as sort of the justification for policing and securing the border, as crime fighting, much like domestically also, the rising crime is also these images of, rising organized crime or rising crime in general is used as a pretense for militarizing policing. But increasingly, the narrative of crime fighting as war fighting has sort of taken over. And so this has consequences for how enforcement happens. So for example, the war narrative allows for questions about, well, who should be doing the policing, right? And how policing should be happening. And so if policing all of a sudden equals defense, either because it happens at the border or because we're at war against this imaginary enemy, then it quickly provides a justification for the use of the military. And I wondered, well, how the book might help us sort of think through the notion of security itself, and whether how borders are policed responds in part to sort of what the prevailing ideas of crime and security are in a given point in time. And given that this is the 3rd edition of the book, maybe those changing notions of what security is, I wondered if that's a theme that you think might be worth capturing in the conclusions or at some point in the discussion of the book, or if you're maybe already doing that. So linked to this point is this security puzzle that you were mentioning in your presentation just a moment ago. So why we keep using and reproducing our current policing strategies if they're not effective in terms of curbing trafficking, and they may even be counterproductive through these feedback effects. And so one of the answers in the book is tied to this performative component, right? So the goal is not necessarily to be more effective at curbing trafficking, but effective in terms of mobilizing support for a certain kind of policing. I find lots of parallels with internal security in this as well. And sort of thinking like, there's really no distinction between right and left anymore in that space either, right? So the left all of a sudden found itself, the right has always campaigned on this sort of like punitive security strategies, and the left all of a sudden had to kind of like move towards that kind of discourse to compete and to ensure, that they can win elections. So in the introduction, you say, well, crucial to generating this support is the increased use of more sophisticated surveillance technologies, perhaps as something that governments can easily point to, right? It's something that it's a strong signal. Look, this is what I'm doing. I'm, adding these technologies, or I have the military with their big guns, policing the border. It's something easily identifiable. So this sort of made me wonder, there's a change in the way that borders are policed. And this made me wonder about 2 things. One is, well, why there's change at all, and whether that is connected to these changing notions of security, rather than changes in the threats themselves. Although we can talk about that, maybe there is an actual, change in the threat and not just a perception. And second, I wondered about the continuities in the dynamics of border policing, particularly as a strategy for social control. After all, the goal of policing has always been othering, as a strategy to achieve sort of this the social control, you know, is building images of a dangerous other that we're protecting against. So again, since this is the third edition of the book, what are, you think, the practices or the narratives and processes that are continuities and that have led to where border policing is today? Can you trace some of them through the 3 editions of the book? I wondered, you know, like I was thinking, like for domestic, you know, policing back in, you know, the beginning of the 20th century or whatever, like dogs were a novelty when you were doing protest policing. And nowadays, you know, there are tanks on the street. So there's a technological evolution, but like the purpose continues to be sort of the same, basically. Another, I think, important theme that I think, you know, is a recurring theme in your body of work more generally, if I may sort of interpret it that way, is sort of this political economy of the clandestine and the clandestine movements, and the state as a key actor that enables that. And so if there are clandestine border crossings, it is because the state somehow enables them. We might chalk it up to individuals, you know, individual customs agents who are corrupt, but this is not always the case. And it would also turn our attention or our discussion into one about, well, individuals as opposed to a systemic structural enabling of certain practices. So there are instances of intentional institutional state action that enable illegality. And you know, you talk about examples in the second edition of the book. There's an example of US, the federal government benefiting from car seizures at the border and how that provides income. There are examples of that scattered across the world, right? So I'm thinking, for example, the informal regulation of contraband in North Africa, which creates, you know, employment opportunities, allows for trade, agreements between state and rebels in Myanmar, which create peace in exchange for drug trafficking. Yeah. The auctioning of illegally caught abalone in South Africa, which, you know, not only does it end up back in the hands of criminals, but it also gives about 20% of the revenue of the government agency that is in charge of the fisheries comes from that auctioning of that illegally caught abalone. So, you know, I think this is one really provocative point in the book, is that when states allow illegal border crossing, it's because they gain something from it. And therefore, they have a vested interest in perpetuating this. But at the same time, an acknowledgement of that would be terrible publicity. So they have to repackage it as something that looks like, you know, they're fighting against this thing. So all of this sort of long winding statement is to ask whether you think there are sort of particular lessons that we can learn from the focus on the Mexico-US case that apply beyond that, or if there are, you know, ways in which the case of Mexico-US is particularly unique. Another theme is connected to sort of the reasons behind the clandestine border movements. And in the introduction, you sort of touch on, well, trafficking results in part because there's poverty and violence in other countries, you know, beyond the US, in particular, you know, Mexico, Central America. It's one of the reasons for undocumented immigration into the US. But the truth is that many people who live in border towns on the US side also participate in illegally moving, you know, stuff across the border, partly as a result of the deterioration of economic conditions and labor in the US. And many Americans, on the other hand, live as undocumented immigrants in Mexico. So I wondered if the third edition of the book touches on any of these issues at all. And then the last theme I would like to touch on, and I think I'm a little over on time, is on those who do the policing. So in the introduction to the third edition, there are references to the state, as you say, the state is a non-unitary actor. And I was curious about whether you found, you know, evidence of tensions within those who do the actual policing at the border. I'm thinking, for example, about sort of divergent opinions on how policing should take place, how this might impact the treatment of migrants or of traffickers at the border. So in my own work and in my own conversations with police officers in widely different contexts, there's always some version of a statement like, well, there are people within the force who subscribe to, the fight fire with fire approach. They think that we're at war, but that's not all of us. Some of us, think differently, and we think we should be doing things differently. So I've wondered, if that is tied to perhaps who these officers are, or where they're in the chain of command, and how that might translate or not into the organizational dynamics and practices on the ground. I was curious if you found any evidence of this kind of dynamic also in your own work. As I said at the beginning, and this is to wrap up, I find lots of parallels between the dynamics at the border and the militarization of crime and protest policing more generally. So I wondered if you think there's something particularly unique of border policing that we should be thinking about perhaps differently, or perhaps this is sort of the origin of this militarized trend that we see at the domestic level and beyond, because there are certainly, we could think in terms of like what diffusion effects this has had, in other countries via, a variety of mechanisms. I'm going to leave it here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to read, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great.
Thank you, Lucia. Peter, would you like to address Lucia's comments?
Sure, just briefly, though I should say briefly does not do justice to all the comments and your terrific questions. A lot of what you said, I'm going to have to give some serious thought to, but there were some questions towards the end of your comments, and I very much loved it and welcome that you tried to make it not just about the border, right? It's the comparisons across the rest of the world, and then comparisons that are within countries, militarization of policing and so on. So it's not just a border story or just a U.S.-Mexico border story. It's interesting that you push in that direction, because I made a decision, rightly or wrongly, to make this third edition more U.S.-Mexico border focused than the first edition. The first edition, as some of you who've looked at it a long time ago may remember, there was a comparative chapter extending the analysis to the external borders of the European Union. And that allowed me to frame the story more broadly. And I teased out some interesting parallels and similarities and differences across European cases. At that time, it was Germany, Poland I looked at and did some brief field work there, and Mexico, and then Spain, Morocco as well. That was a fun chapter to write. I enjoyed the research. I think it really did broaden the story. But what's fascinating is that all the reactions I got to the book, whether students, other scholars, policy people, whatever, no one ever mentioned that comparative stuff. It was just incredible. Everyone thought this book was just about the US-Mexico border, and everyone forgot this comparative stuff. And so when I did the third edition, I said, fine, I'll throw in the towel. I got rid of that chapter because guess what? I had to make room for Trump. And so part of what reason the book did well initially was because a fairly short book. And so I couldn't just expand and expand and expand. And so something had to go. And so what went was the comparisons, the framing the story more comparatively and globally, which sounds like you would like me to have done, but I went in the opposite direction, at least for the purposes of the book. I mean, my own work has gone more global you know, my other work since the Border Games books has been more comparative and global and so on. So I've thought about some of the questions that you pose, but I don't do them justice, I should say, in this. You know, the lessons for the U.S.-Mexico border case for the rest of the world. I mean, in some sense, you know, it's an extreme case, but it's also, the dynamics are evident at the most general level. You can say there's a sort of fundamental tension between keeping facilitating globalization and facilitating cross-border flows and political pressures to keep stuff out. You know, simultaneously, you know, the dual bridges and barriers. And states all over the world have always been grappling with this problem, but I would say it's gotten much more intense in recent years and decades. And it's especially evident where territorial divides of great inequality happen, right? So U.S.-Mexico, Southern Europe with North Africa, even Eastern Europe and Western Europe and so on, parts of Asia, East Asia and so on. So this is a tension that border officials constantly deal with, but especially politicized in certain boundaries where there's especially serious migratory pressures and so on. I mean, the reason it's an extreme case is Mexico has the misfortune of being geographically situated next to the world's largest importer of illicit drugs and migrant labor. I mean, it's a structural situation that most other countries don't face, a 2,000-mile long border and political pressure to do something about it. And so in that sense, it's you can't point to you know, any place else in the world that's quite like that. Now, your other issues about sort of, you know, militarization of policing more generally. What's interesting in the case of my book is that when it comes to drug control, I actually treat Mexico's militarization of the drug war as essentially, and actually now militarization of immigration control, using the Mexican National Guard to stop Central American migrants, as essentially a thickening of U.S. border controls, right? They're basically, you know, the border is outward, right? Mexico trying to stop drugs, trying to stop Central Americans. It's ultimately serving U.S. policy objectives of stopping people and prohibited goods crossing the border, but Mexico is, you know, at the front lines, if you will, at the Guatemala border. But it also, it's a more global story, if you will. I mean, I did a book co-authored with Ethan Nadelman called Policing the Globe, about the internationalization of crime control, right? You know, that could be pitched as border controls extended deeply outward, right? It starts in the visa issuing office overseas and training police agents all over the world and so on. But for the purpose of this book, it's very much sort of the spectacle and the political theater, as you point to, of the borderline itself. And what makes it different is that I do think that the border provides a kind of political stage, a highly visible spot that politicians can exploit in a way that policing in general doesn't quite work. Also, the militarization of policing, at least in the US, is allowed much more along the border than with internally. So the extent that the US military can actually play a role, it's much more able to facilitate US policing at the border than it can internally. Right, and so you see, and you know, just the power of the state to be invasive and interrogate and invade privacy and go through your luggage and everything is omnipresent at the border in a way that it's not once you're more than 100 miles inland. And so there's some peculiarities of border policing that make it sort of an extreme case of militarized policing. It's not. Having said that, you know, Trump actually deployed a special border patrol SWAT team to Portland, right? So this was the you know, agents who were trained in Homeland Security for dealing with border issues were then sent to Portland, Oregon, to deal with protesters and so on. So there's some slippage in that regard. So let's see what else. I don't, you know, you asked whether I include in the third edition issues of sort of the political economy beneficiaries at the border on the U.S. side. No, the updating is mostly not the political economy of smuggling, but the politics of policing. And it's overwhelmingly a migration story rather than a drug story. I really gave equal weight to drugs and migration in the earlier editions. And Trump really made drugs migration was the #1 priority issue. He tried to mingle the two in many ways, saying the wall would stop drugs and migrants, right? And or migrants are carrying drugs and whatnot. But for the most part, and including pressure on Mexico, the pressure is overwhelmingly on migration, and not on the drug front. So much so that Mexico caves under U.S. pressure about migration, but actually, to my surprise, was able to push back vigorously and bluntly and publicly against U.S. pressure to the Cienfuegos, General Cienfuegos corruption scandal. Mexico basically said, sorry, you just made this up, goodbye, and has essentially sent U.S.-Mexico drug relations back to the 1980s. Essentially, it's quite striking, the lack of U.S. leverage on drugs, but the obvious coercive leverage in the case of migration, which is something I would actually appreciate you folks giving me some insight and understanding. But anyway, I have more, but I'll stop there so that we can open it up.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I would like to open the floor to other people's comments, so please raise your hand so I can start taking names. Use your yellow hand so I can actually see it.
And if no one has questions, I have questions.
Okay.
So.
Well, meanwhile, I will ask one that as I read your chapter yesterday, and then today I woke up to listening to on NPR Duque from Colombia talking about how welcoming Colombia is to the 1 million immigrants from Venezuela, and it's like completely like the discourse was that we are totally open for them to come, and we have all these programs to support them, and then until the very end he finally said, oh, but this will not last forever. But that was the most pushback that he put on it, and I started thinking, like, what is the theatrics of this? What does he want to portray, and why is he actually coming to say that to the US right now? Well, I guess because he was in New York. So anyway, I would like to have some comments on that. And then we have also Andreas and Benito, who have already, we will go in that order as well. So please, Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for a really fascinating read. It's really a chapter, an introductory chapter that makes one want to read the whole book. So it's a brilliant synthesis, and and whatever I ask is just based on that. I haven't read more. I'm very sympathetic to your symbolic Goffmanian view on certain policies as stage acting, as performative, as dramaturgical. So I like that, and I have done that myself in other contexts. But I have a few questions related to that. The first one is, if you analyze the symbolic import of those policies, I think you, that would be a question. I sense you are kind of neglecting the objective or material side to it. But I think you need it to make your argument about the symbolic, about the symbolic weight of policies. You seem to say that problems haven't changed. They were always there since the Mexican Revolution. The border has been open, drugs have been flowing north, guns have been flowing southwards, etc. But I think it would be good to have a kind of some medium ground between nothing has changed and everything has changed, and something similar on the side of the effectiveness of policies. I'm very much persuaded by the idea that these policies have an important symbolic dimension, but they also have very, very heavy material relevance. I mean, these policies, they have been destroying the lives and livelihoods of many immigrants who have been deported, have stopped others, have sent others to the desert. So these are materially extremely important policies, and I think I would like to have some kind of some sense of some greater emphasis towards kind of the material side of those policies, because they do have that side, even if they are not effective in the sense of reaching their stated purpose. Then about kind of the symbolic or performative side, I would like to see more analytic structure. Probably it's in the book, probably it's not in the introduction, but I think, for example, the symbolic purposes or the theatrical purposes of achieving deterrence is very different from signaling commitment. So I think these different audiences, different challenges. So I think it would be nice to kind of to bring order into that realm of symbolic politics. Then you kind of the third point, you much emphasize kind of front stage drama, to say these are performances towards certain audiences. Probably you leave out potential immigrants, but that's another point. I think one thing that's always fascinating when thinking in Goffmanian terms is not just to conceive politics in terms of front stage activities, but also to incorporate backstage activities. And I think in particular, if Lucia talks about the difference between Democrats and Republicans, I think Democrats have today, the Biden administration, they have a very, their task is much more complicated. They face genuine dilemmas between, on the one hand, signaling commitment, which was easy for Trump, build the wall. They have to do that, you pointed that out, but they also have to signal their humanitarian side. They have to kind of do border policing with a human face.
Right.
So they need to do, I think, a mixture between hiding things, putting them to the backstage of politics, or doing different performances, kind of performing their humanitarian side. So this might be an additional element. And finally, on Goffman and those things, whenever I incorporate something like that in my text, I always face kind of, well, often the feedback that people think that's really exotic for political science. It's kind of relatively common, and kind of sociologists know Goffman and they know how to handle him, and it's part of their tradition. But in political science, you're really kind of a weirdo if you talk about Goffman. Who is Goffman? So the one stream of debate where political science is really kind of Goffmanian in an unconscious and under-theorized way is in the whole literature on signaling. Right. I don't like the term signaling. It's imprecise. It's probably the wrong term. You talk about gestures. I would probably talk about communicative action. But it's it's, I would say, the bridge to the mainstream of political science. And I think much of the things you analyze might fit into that literature. How to create how to signal commitment, how to assume certain costs, etc. So I think if you build that bridge, you will broaden your audience, I think. And finally, just outside these 4 points, just a tiny remark about your description of López Obrador's anti-transmigration policy as kind of the outsourcing of dirty politics, of the dirty tasks of US border politics. It's a tiny irony there that just a couple of weeks ago, or some weeks ago, the government enacted a law prohibiting outsourcing. So if this is a form of outsourcing, it should be prohibited under the government's own law. But that's just a interesting irony. Thank you.
I should probably respond, huh? Maria?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah. I'll start with your point about Colombia, Venezuela. I claim no expertise on Colombia and Venezuela, but context obviously matters. And what I find interesting is that historically, Venezuelans have been sort of, Colombians have had an inferiority complex. I mean, basically, Venezuelans have been the ones trying to keep them out. And I have no doubt, at least talking to my Colombian students and colleagues and friends, that Colombia is enjoying the tables turned. That basically it's totally flipped now. Colombia is the desirable place to be. You come, oh look, we're so welcoming, and so on. So there's this rich irony of you've never liked us Colombians, but now we're the ones welcoming you. I don't know how much that mileage we get from that to explain the president's commentary, but he's taken the high ground, but as you pointed out, this is not a permanent condition. He's doing the Andrea Merkel of Colombia, right? It's this kind of we're humanitarians, come in, but this is not a permanent condition, and so on. And there's not a backlash, at least not yet, within Colombia about this. But when that comes, I think things would in fact change. But I can't say with any authority anything beyond that. Andreas, thank you for all those comments and questions. Really terrific. I don't know. I can't probably in a short few minutes address them all. But let me just do a few of them. One is. Basically, your opening where you say, basically, I emphasize the symbolic and neglect the material, right? I think this, and in the book itself, and I'm sorry if in the introduction it gives the sense of sort of symbolism is everything and the material is inconsequential, but a big part of the argument is image effect and symbolic politics matter, but the material consequences of those actions have a feedback loop that creates a self-perpetuating escalation. So I don't, for example, in the 1990s, the image of order on the border, which the display of force in south of San Diego and El Paso and so on, disperses migrants to more difficult, dangerous terrain, right? That leads to pressure to then deploy more agents in Arizona and elsewhere in Texas and so on. So the escalation, there's feedback effects from the material consequences that also contribute to escalation. So it's not just the symbolism that's going on here, because ultimately, keep in mind that the research question is what explains escalation. And so, one of your comments was, well, one of the material consequences I don't pay enough attention to or give enough acknowledgement of are sort of the real life consequences for the migrants themselves. And actually, a few people said that about the first edition as well. And in some ways, it's guilty as charged in the sense that, I basically say anything. I'm focusing on what is relevant to explaining escalation, right? And the deaths at the border, which I acknowledge in the book itself and cite those statistics and cite the articles and books written about it, and De Leon's book about the border and so on, all the stuff that's come out actually in recent years, that doesn't actually explain the escalation though. That explains the consequence, a humanitarian disaster at the border, but not the escalation of border policing itself. So I don't know if I'm making sense about the sort of the material consequences of escalation that I mostly focus on have a feedback loop reinforcing further escalation. Fascinating that you mentioned, front stage drama, but there needs to be more backstage. I mean, the body of the book itself, in the empirical chapters, I talk about front stage and backstage behavior, right? And so, for example, Trump's family detention, that was supposed to be kind of backstage until journalists got inside the detention space and had, audio recordings of wailing, crying children, which were then played on media across the world and just completely backfired on the Trump administration. Had to backtrack from that stance. Backstage would be, in fact, Mexico deploying its National Guard. Maybe that's front stage for Mexico, but in terms of U.S. politics, it's barely noticed, right? So basically, from the point of the Biden administration or the Trump administration, Mexico cracking down on Central Americans doesn't really make a sustained impact on public opinion in the U.S., right? Whereas it's obviously noticed in Mexico. But from the perspective of the politics of the border in my book, that's backstage action. Or even right now, the situation with Haitians trying to cross the U.S. border right today, like in the last few days. Notice that journalists are barred from that encampment, and the airspace right above those 10,000 Haitians is no man's land. You're not allowed to fly drones in there for footage and so on. So the Biden administration is desperately trying to keep that off stage and backstage, and the media is noticing it. And so there's this tension between what gets on stage versus off stage. So anyway, in the body of the book itself, I do talk about front stage versus backstage. So not just front stage. I love your comment about the way to broaden the interest in this book to political science, mainstream political science, is work on signaling. And I guess I would add audience costs. There's this whole stuff on audience costs. And I think you're absolutely right. And if I was doing this again as my dissertation, I somehow managed to get a job in political science with Goffman. Today, I probably wouldn't be able to do so. But I'm already a tenured professor, and so I'm not really, right now my interest is making this book of interest across disciplines rather than appealing more to mainstream political science at this point. And in fact, I would say the people who have read the book, engaged it in their own work, used it for teaching, have been more outside of political science than inside of political science. And that's fine with me. And I think if I had really pitched it much more within the mainstream of political science debates about signaling and so on, it would have come at the cost, talk about audience costs, it would have come at the cost of being off-putting to geographers and anthropologists and sociologists and so on, who are basically not immersed in that literature. And so what I loved about Goffman is that as non-mainstream as it is in political science, the points he was making that I found so insightful are easily digestible and understandable across disciplines. And it's precisely for that reason that Goffman himself was possibly not taken as seriously as he should have within sociology itself. But that's a time for another discussion. But anyway, thank you, Andreas, for those very interesting comments and questions.
Thank you, Peter. Now, Benito, would you like to comment?
Oh, thank you, Maria. And thank you, Peter, for accepting the invitation to participate in this seminar. I love the title of your book. It's great. Border Games. I don't know if you came up with that title before the Hunger Games movie, but if you did, it was genius.
I did.
It was genius. And I think the title is very telling, and I'd like to pick up on that, because it's not a game between equals. Certainly Mexico is much more vulnerable, weaker, and dependent on US policy and the US economy in general. And Trump was very successful in using certain threats. I don't remember any other US president using tariffs as a threat to get Mexico to comply with something that he wanted. But Trump used tariff threats against Mexico very successfully. It also used another threat that it's directly concerning your book, which is the threat of closure or closing the border. The Trump administration used it several times. And he basically, in the negotiations with the Mexican government, he got away with everything he wanted, from especially immigration. Yeah. And he never went through with his threat of closing the border. When he did, it was because of the pandemic. And now, the border is closed, not to merchandise traffic, but basically to Mexicans crossing the border. And now the game is about reopening it again. Yeah, and the López Obrador administration is desperately trying to convince the Biden administration to reopen the border. The Biden administration is in no hurry to open the border. The federal government in the US doesn't have the same pressure that the Mexican government has to reopen the border. So the game has changed, and it will be interesting if you have something to say about that in your book. How this instrument is used by the U.S. to get the Mexican government to comply with its demands. I understand, and I'm not very sure about that now, but I understand that the U.S. government wants Mexico to cooperate with its policy against China, particularly communications and the I don't quite remember the name of this Chinese firm that sold equipment to the Mexican government that the US sees as a threat to national security. And I understand that the negotiations about that are stalled, but it is one of the issues that it's affecting the possibility of reopening the border soon. So I was wondering if you are considering the possibility of dealing with this topic in your book.
Thank you, Benito. Really interesting comment and question. I'm glad you like the title. I put a lot of serious thought into titles. So I think I take titles more seriously than most of my colleagues. They're certainly not an afterthought. Now, having said that, the title Border Games, there has been the sort of concern that some people might find it off-putting because it's belittling. It kind of takes lightly, or because it's a game, calling it a game suggests I'm not taking it seriously what's going on the border. So that's one possible down. If anyone reads the book can tell that I take it deadly seriously. But the calling it a game isn't 100% fail safe. And you're absolutely right. It's not an equal game. In fact, U.S. and Mexico have become far more intertwined, interdependent, thanks to NAFTA and economic integration in general. But arguably, Mexico, through that process, has become much more vulnerable to the U.S. than it has been historically, in terms of just the sheer, amount of its economy tied to an open border, and it's an imbalance. So the U.S. wouldn't be that devastated by closing the border, but Mexico would be, and Canada would be as well, actually. So there's a parallel there. It's asymmetric interdependence, right? It's not feel-good interdependence where you're mutually vulnerable and beneficial. It's asymmetric. But here's the puzzle I find. You pointed out that Trump was remarkably successful in threatening tariffs and coercing Mexico to do what it wished on the migration front. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's sort of, it was so overt that, it was basically front stage, action. It wasn't, there was a lot of backstage negotiations, obviously, but it was all very, very public in terms of threats and then capitulation. The puzzle to me, and then the threat of closure, and you said basically that you thought it was like the first time that had been done. Actually, the U.S. had done Operation Intercept in 1969, I believe, closed the border for a few weeks to pressure Mexico to do more about marijuana crop eradication, which Mexico then did. And then there was Operation Intercept 2 after Kiki Camarena was murdered in 85, 86. Which basically was a low point in U.S.-Mexico drug relations, but then ushered in a period of much more cooperation as well after that. So this was just sort of taking the threat to the next level. But the tariff threat, that was an instrument that Trump loves tariffs. I mean, this was something he liked to play with. So it was China and so on. So it was kind of his thing. But Mexico is particularly vulnerable. But the puzzle for me, which I mentioned earlier, and I'd really appreciate someone to comment on who knows something about this, is U.S. has this obvious overt leverage of Mexico on migration in terms of stopping Central Americans and essentially becoming Trump's wall. Mexico becomes the wall. But on the drug war front, Mexico basically thumbs its nose at the U.S. and the U.S. is silent about it. I think partly it's the timing. Basically, Mexico lashed out at the U.S. after getting the general back, saying the evidence was fabricated. It was right after the U.S. election, and the U.S. was focused on contesting the election. Trump wasn't paying attention to Mexico at that point at all. And then Biden administration, drugs were not actually a high priority issue. So maybe the timing explains it. But for actual on the ground, in the trenches, U.S. drug warriors, this was, a crisis. And I'm sure it's ongoing in terms of just the degree to which Mexico said F you to the U.S. And actually, I'm also curious to know how that played out within Mexico, where they basically exonerated a general without even looking at the evidence, because the president said the evidence is fabricated, with no end of discussion. Right, so the contrast between how the drug issue is handled and the migration issue is handled, the previous threats of closing the border, Operation Intercept and Intercept 2, were all about drugs. Now it's all about migration, right? And so the question is it basically just been a US choice to not make drugs a bigger issue? And then Mexico would have caved or alternative explanation is precisely because Mexico's cooperating against Central Americans, that they have more leverage over the US on the drug issue. It's similar to Turkey leverage with the EU, basically because the EU now depends on Turkey bottling up refugees there. Turkey is actually much more insulated from criticism, external criticism of human rights and authoritarianism and so on, precisely because the EU has to treat Turkey with softer gloves now, precisely because Turkey is playing such an instrumental role in stopping migrants. So the question is Mexico now doing the same in the US, and therefore you can't beat up on Mexico on drugs the way that you used to? But that's just speculation on my part.
Thank you.
Sorry, anybody else would like to have something? We still have a few minutes. Sandra, please.
Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Peter. Hey, it's great to see you again, and hopefully we'll have you here sometime soon.
Yes. I have your book here on my shelf. I was going to show it to you.
Thank you so much.
Have you sign it virtually? All right. Anyway.
But thanks a lot, Peter. It's great to see how this intertwining of the agendas between migration and drug policy, which of course I think that you do. This is a great work that you've been doing, and I love the issue of the expressive role, the instrumental role. I think that is it's very useful to think about it from a closer view over time. I think we've been intertwining these different agendas, although I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, and it's great to have this work and a third new edition. So congratulations again.
Thank you.
I'm thinking precisely because of that. I'm thinking of work that our colleagues here at CIDE have done on the role that the U.S. has played in a very explicit way in Mexico, training police forces, right? Like in terms of actual training for the specific purpose of drug trafficking. And I'm wondering, when you say Mexico has been the border, right, has been the wall, I agree with that, but I'm thinking about how this goes beyond sort of this expressive role, or more about the public opinion dimensions that you discussed, Peter. And in a more specific way, I'm thinking of what has been happening with the National Migration Institute lately, with a very upfront, repressive behavior. And to what extent is that also something that we're seeing in working in tandem with U.S. authorities, or not, in the way that we have seen that happening? That has been happening between U.S. government and police training in that regard, or how that becomes part of the influence for migration policies in Mexico, because I don't think we've been discussing enough of how that may be also playing out for the actual behavior of police forces in Mexico if we follow the logic of how the DEA has also played a role for drug trafficking in Mexico, for example.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that in the first edition of the book, I emphasized how much migration control was restricted overwhelmingly to the borderline itself and didn't extend into Mexico much. And compared to drugs, which was basically, I talk about the extension of US DEA agents into Mexico, and training and US Mexico security and law enforcement cooperation overwhelmingly focused on drug issues. And now I have to basically tweak that quite a bit and basically say, although drugs was the pioneering issue in US-Mexico police and security cooperation that migration has been the big growth area. And in fact, what's interesting is now that US-Mexico anti-narcotics cooperation is arguably in crisis and thrown back to the situation in the 80s. On the case of migration, my guess is it's percolating as before, and there's an overlap between these two missions in terms of, you know, the forces deployed against them, whether it's the technology that looks inside of tractor trailers, you know, to see if there's people or drugs inside. It's the same. It's the backscatter, you know, machines deployed on the southern border. It's the Mexican National Guard, which was originally created to fight drug trafficking organizations, now deployed against for migration control. But I don't have the details, actually, much details about the role of US training in that regard. There's actually not, as you know better than me, that's backstage, right? There's not a lot of publicity about that. I know the Merida Initiative involved increased cooperation and training, and, you know, Mexico's Plan Sur, you know, the US basically has Homeland Security advisors in Mexico, Mexico City in the south. They also have Homeland Security advisors in Guatemala. And also, so the Department of Homeland Security is now more forward beyond the US border than the predecessor INS ever was, right? But that there's not, it's a pretty opaque thing, and it would have strengthened my book if I'd done a more thorough updating or even a new book to get into the details of that much more, because you're onto something important, and I only really just touch on it. But if you see anything on that, I would be appreciative if you send it my way. But you know, as I said, at one point you could say drugs was a cross-border cooperative issue and migration wasn't. But now it's both issues. And so one question to you, I know we've run out of time, but I do have a list of questions I was going to ask you, and this reminds me of one I wanted to ask you, which is, you know, Mexico, right now, the reason there's been what's enabled so much cooperation against migration is that the migrants are third country nationals. They're not Mexicans, right? And so but what happens, for whatever reason, there's all kinds of literature on this discussing why Mexican migration has not only stopped, but reversed, right? There's actually a lot more visas to the US now than there used to be for Mexicans, right? So, but what happens if Mexican migration picks up again and surges at some point? I would think then cooperation on migration matters is far more complicated and politically dicey within Mexico. Maybe the Mexican public opinion has made peace with the pragmatic reality of having to be the US border in terms of Central Americans, but not in terms of stopping Mexicans. The idea of Mexican government stopping Mexicans from leaving is taboo. So I would think that the third edition of Border Game, fourth edition of Border Games, there might be increased Mexican migration again. I don't know if this is just a temporary situation right now because of demographics and birth rates and so on, or if we're actually going to see a resurgence of Mexican migration, which would complicate the Border Game dramatically. Any final thoughts on that? I know we've run over. But...
Sandra, you want to answer, or? I have heard that it has been increasing. Like recently, I
very recently.
Yeah, recently.
Right.
Like about 500,000 of Mexicans were detained. And so it's increasing again, and it will complicate it for sure.
Right.
But now the government right now is taking into its advantage, saying that we have high remittances, right? And so that's good for us. Like that's how it's been holding on, saying high flow remittances and we have a higher GDP, right? So they're taking this, they have sort of been taking advantage of that to say that thumbs up for for new income inflows.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting is that a game changer at the border has been the use of the asylum system for Central Americans, right? They're not trying to run away from Border Patrol. They're actually trying to find them, right? Well, imagine Mexicans running from drug violence in Mexico, claiming asylum. I mean, it's a puzzle to me why Mexicans have not done that. I mean, the levels of violence overall are lower than in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, but still, certain areas of Mexico, it would be perfectly reasonable for people to go to the border and try to claim asylum. It's interesting.
Yep. Well, lately there has been, at least from what I've been receiving from requests, there has been rising asylum requests from Guerrero, but not necessarily Guerrero being like the high networks of migrants as in Michoacan, for example. So maybe you need that pick again from those specific places. However, in Michoacan, there have been enough networks of communities sort of fighting together through different means. So that might be sort of acting in different ways for actual asylum cases to be rising from those places where they would actually be organized. I think that's the network part that might be missing.
The other thing is Mexicans may have access to the U.S. in ways that Central Americans don't. I mean, I actually have a student last year who fled Monterrey because family members had been killed. And is now a student here at Brown, but he says the whole reason he's in the U.S. is because his family moved to Texas, and then now he's a student. So the legal access is arguably greater for Mexicans now than for Central Americans.
Yeah, I guess the access that I guess it's over 60% of Mexicans have a relative, close relative in the U.S. That opens some sort of different network of support. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think this is a great presentation. Thank you, Peter, for agreeing on doing this. And as Sandra said, and I said it as well, we will try to bring you in person soon.
We'd love that. Sorry to keep you all later than the designated time. But thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all.
For bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Peter.
Ciao.
Bueno, pues